Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of the Digital Drop podcast. Today I'm joined by Rob, Tab and Nej, and we will discuss the importance of choosing the right CMS for your membership organization. We all know that membership organizations have a lot to choose when it comes to appointing their new CMS. It can be licensed, traditional, open source CMS, headless CMS, and so on. So luckily, today we're joined by Nej, who has been in the industry for over 20 years now, and he worked on both sides, the agency but also the vendor side. So I think we can probably start off with asking Nej if he was looking for a new CMS for a membership organization, how would he approach this process?
Okay, so it's a very broad question. I think that the first thing that I would try to understand is the context that I'm in. So if I was working for a membership organization, I think the first thing to recognize is that, membership organizations, although they have a lot of common requirements, are very broad in terms of how they're structured, the scale of them, the numbers of people they have, the kind of budgets they work with, and so on. So I think the first thing is to understand what my starting position is and what are the remits of what I'm trying to do. If, for argument's sake, we're going to say for an average, typical membership organization, even though there's probably no such thing, as far as the process of selecting the right product is concerned, the first thing is not to think about what CMS I want, not to think about the CMS. So one of the mistakes that I've seen a lot throughout my career, that I believe personally is a mistake, is a lot of organizations will kind of make a decision before they actually start a selection process, because the person that's making the decision has experience with a certain platform, or they've been to a trade show or read a certain report where they want to have this particular technology. So I don't think that you should ever have the technology driving the decisions, or the technology choice driving the decisions. What you need to understand is, first of all, your objectives, your starting point, what you have within the organization, what are the objectives, what are you trying to achieve with this particular project, because it's not just about buying a CMS. Nobody goes and acquires a CMS solution unless it's part of an ongoing project, which is usually a website redevelopment or creation of some sort of a members portal. By understanding the objectives, you can start the process of defining almost like a checklist of the kinds of functionalities that you want. However, what you have to take into account is the other solutions and technologies that you've got within the organization. So one typical example, some membership organizations have good member management solutions in place. Some do it through CRM technology, and some don't really have anything robust at all. If you look at traditional CMSs, one of the big differentiators for those technologies was some of them would provide membership functionality and membership management functionality out of the box. Some of them wouldn't. So understanding what you've got will be one of the primary steps in making a decision, because in this day and age, any enterprise level solution such as CMS is going to be to some extent integrated into other system. It's going to provide a part of a digital journey that touches a variety of systems. So unless you know what other systems you've got in place, you can't understand which parts of the journey you want this solution to fulfill. Now, the other thing is, I mentioned earlier, is to understand your organization. So by understanding the basic constraints, such as budget, the resources you've got available, the types of skill sets that you've got, will also help you eliminate a lot of potential options and create a shortlist. Because I think there's last time I checked, I think there was over 2,000 CMS technologies out there. So the first part of the process is to kind of define the key criteria. What level of software do you want? Do you want enterprise, and can you afford enterprise? Do you want licensed and mid-tier? Do you want open source? And this is also driven by understanding your organization. If everything else in your organization is based, for example, on Microsoft .NET technologies, then it straight away makes sense to buy a technological solution that's based on the same foundation, because any integration is going to be a lot more feasible and a lot more doable.
Question.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, you mentioned about internal skill sets, like analyzing what we have. Now, what are your guys' thoughts on shoehorning your solution around your internal skill set? So, for example, if internally you have PHP developers, should you just be looking at PHP solutions? My thought is you should analyze your business objectives, as you'd mentioned earlier, what you're trying to achieve, and then sort of pick the ideal solution rather than shoehorning. But I know that everyone has different opinions on this, because if you've got a team of 10 PHP developers, how are you going to retrain them? Where are they going to fit in? So these kind of considerations, what do you think about them?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize and understand is there is no one ideal solution, right? For whatever your requirements are, there's going to be a number of solutions that can do the jobs, and the solutions that will meet your requirements. So what we would typically do with any of our clients is narrow process down to a short list of potentially suitable products, then go and try to quantify and detail up to 3 solutions that we feel best meet those requirements, and then present the pros and cons of each. So again, and I did mention to look at what kind of resource you have. I wasn't in that moment thinking about the development resource specifically. I was thinking more about the level of technical ability that people who will be interacting with the CMS have on a day-to-day basis. There's no point if you don't have people that understand certain features and functionalities and how to set up marketing automation and how to do a lot of the things that these CMSs will provide to you, and you don't have any plans of putting people in place that will look at those things, and there's no point paying for those functionalities. So as long as you recognize there isn't one solution, there's more than one solution, and multiple solutions could be put into the same context to fulfill the needs.
Yeah, and I think around what you just said there about the marketing automation, your internal skill sets away from technical people, I'd say that if you didn't have the internal skill set as an organization, rather than maybe dismiss certain CMSs based on what's available to them, obviously agencies are there, training is there to help upskill your internal staff to utilize those particular CMSs. But overall, it comes down to what you're trying to achieve as an organization. And I think as well, you mentioned around the certain CMSs. For me, one of the big things to look at when you are looking at CMSs is growth plans. So as an organization, what are you looking to do, not just for the next year, but for the next 5 years? And as a vendor, what is that CMS vendor or those CMS vendors that you're looking at planning to do over the next year and 5 years? Because depending on the size of membership organization, sometimes, they might have legacy CMSs that are a bit restricted, and, their growth plans and update plans and upgrade plans are not really existent. So it's really about analyzing not just the functionalities, but where that vendor is trying to go with the product, basically, to make sure that it aligns with your goals and objectives.
Yeah, the product roadmap is absolutely one of the key steps of understanding where it is, not just where the product is going, but what a lot of, I would say the vast majority of organizations overlook is where the company that's developing the product is going. So all companies are at some point of a company maturity curve, and this is why it's important to get a company to work with a vendor that's at the right stage within their own life cycle to be a good match for your organization. One example there would be if where we often see changes or disruptions in that particular relationship between the customer or the organization and the vendor is if the vendor's going through acquisitions, if the vendor kind of jumps up to that next level and then they decide that they're going to change their licensing model, they're going to increase costs, and then all of a sudden, even though they worked very hard to get you on board as a client, you might find yourself not being treated like a particularly important client. So you're absolutely right. You need to understand the roadmap of those things, but all of that comes after understanding your own roadmap. So that these are all the things that we'll do to further filter out the list of potential solutions, which comes at the back end of the process of making a selection.
Yeah. I heard someone wanting to talk, but I think as well, in the whole kind of selection process, it's really key from my end, as dependent on your internal knowledge and skill set, is not to look at functionality of a CMS as an organization yourself, to look at the key objectives that you're trying to achieve. And then if you have the internal sort of technical skill sets, okay, you can then decipher those internal objectives into functionality. But it should be the role of an agency that you partner with, if you don't have those internal technical skill sets, to really dictate, okay, how are we going to achieve those business objectives that you've set out over the next 3 to 5 years? And how are we going to align your different technologies? So you mentioned earlier around CRMs, etc. So how are we going to use that information in the best possible way to service your members and to achieve your business objectives?
And I think you just touched upon a very important consideration in this whole thing. When we're looking to appoint a new CMS, obviously we need to look into requirements first, not set our heart at a particular technology. So understand our current landscape, then also understand the roadmap that we just talked about. So we want to deliver or have in the future. And then at the end of it, we'll have some sort of recommendations. What's important to think about in this process is who is actually delivering this selection process, because an organization can do this sort of in-house process, what we call CMS selection process, but at the same time it can be a bit of a biased process, because there could be individuals that, as you explained, maybe you've got 10 people that are skilled on PHP, and you emotionally can justify as to why the next CMS should also be on PHP. So should you maybe at another point use an agency, somebody who's going to give you an unbiased opinion and say, walk you through the full process of the whole CMS selection process?
Yeah, and I think that comes back to Nej's point earlier around a good agency in these situations will look at your whole internal business model, let's say, and your organization structure, and provide you with multiple options to say, look, this, the pros and cons of, well, this would be the best because X, Y, and Z, but the con will be that you'll have to retrain your staff, or, only a certain amount of your staff will be able to use this, so the others will need to be used elsewhere, etc. And vice versa around other pros and cons. So it's very subjective. There's no one shoe fits all, but it's interesting, and there's a general structure that you can approach, I think, all CMS selection with, that if you follow that process, the end result is 90% of the time, or even more than that, going to be the correct answer, as long as that process was followed properly.
I think that's a risky sentence, the correct answer. Right, sorry, Rob, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just going to say, I think it's interesting that you guys have touched on sort of having in-house developers and stuff, because I would argue that one of the most important things that should be considered is sort of the reliance on developers, and how how your choice of CMS can help enable your marketers or your membership engagement teams to do what they need to do on a daily basis.
Right.
Because, we see teams within membership organizations who want to get things done fast, and they don't want to have to wait for developers to, amend the template on their site so that they can do something. So, a big consideration should be like, choose a CMS which enables your team to do exactly what they need to do on a daily basis.
I think
Yeah, so you've touched on a very interesting point there, and I can clearly see, Rob, that you've worked in contexts and organizations where the CMS has been what we would call in the industry hacked to some extent, because most commercial CMSs, the whole point of them is to enable the maintenance and management of the website and to enable the marketers to do whatever they need to do without the need of technical people getting involved. So if you're in a scenario where everything you want to do, you're waiting on a development team, that's a clear-cut example of whoever's implemented that site has done it to meet the brief in a short-sighted way, and probably not in line with what the vendor would call best practice. But you also touched on another point when you're talking subjectively, and so 10 plus years ago, if we were selling a CMS into an organization, 90% of the time, don't quote me on the numbers, but for argument's sake, 90% of the time, the people spearheading this project or initiative within the organization would be IT departments and IT teams. Now, the vast majority of the time, and in my opinion, rightfully so, it's marketing and communication teams that are spearheading deployment. So you also got now, with membership organizations, this is a cultural and organizational issue, but you've got some, we're working with some very progressive organizations that have got very clued up and independent marketing teams that know what they want and know what they need. And then we also have some clients, not to drop any names, but we also have some clients where we're dealing with IT who don't really understand what the marketers need. So that whole thing, that whole divide goes back to saying, well, understand where you are within the organization. What perspective are you looking for? There's different perspectives of benefits from an organizational point of view.
Yeah,
There's also there's also an element to some things you can do in CMS, but also there's some other parts of it where you have to integrate your CMS with other systems in order to enable this 360 overview of your customers and a lot better user experience. So what's important to consider as well as part of the whole CMS selection process is the integrations, because we know CMS is just for the website. However, it never sits by itself. It's always supplemented and it always works together with some other systems, like it could be, email systems, CRM, AMS, and so on. So we shouldn't really neglect the fact that when choosing a CMS, we should carefully consider the integration points, where the data should sit, because it's not just the functionality that you get as part of the CMS, it's the architectural point of view and how this integration actually helps you with your day-to-day tasks. Can some parts of your new CMS maybe automate some of your workload? So you've got different the sets or steps in your CMS that enable the work internally, highlights if, an article's being published or ready to be published and so on. And also all sorts of notifications that can automatically notify other members of the team to say this has been done, or you need to do a particular task on here. So in essence, there's other two aspects that we should also carefully consider. And I think with quite a lot of CMSs lately, there's something that we called connectors. So if you've got a particular CRM and a particular CMS, maybe it's useful to check if there's a connector that can seamlessly integrate the two systems, so the overall cost of that integration is a lot less and it gives you the right functionalities.
Yeah, and I think sort of to everyone's point, what we're saying is it's a line that I think I first heardNej use about 7-8 years ago, maybe a little bit more, but wow, I've been with this organization too long. But is a good agency works themselves out of a job. So in essence, that initial period where an agency is doing the build and putting those integrations together, that is the heavy lifting for the agency. At the end of it, and to Rob's point, and obviously his angle comes from a digital marketing consultant, but at the end of it, the organization should be enabled, where their skill set permits, to pretty much do what they need to do through the CMS and without recourse to their agency. The agency should only then be used to help, enhance the website and, enhance user experience and, keep a track of how members are engaging and work on additional sort of what we call the continuous improvement stage of a relationship rather than a website build. But yeah, definitely a good agency from the outset should envisage that they're going to work themselves out of a job in essence.
Okay, so based on, all three of you have kind of been the connection between us as an agency and the variety of membership organizations that we've worked with, mostly successfully, some not so successfully over the years. What would you guys, a lot of the time when we're coming into these relationships, we're dealing with organizations that in some way have been burnt or have had a negative experience with the previous organizations or the status quo that they have. So what would you say are the things to be aware of, or some of the less than ideal scenarios that we've found within our client organizations when it comes to that point that you raised, Metab, which is to say good agency versus not so good an agency? What would you say organizations need to be aware of?
I think I'll throw in first, if you don't mind. I think one of the key factors is expectation setting. So when an agency enters a relationship with an organization or vice versa, a lot of the time, I don't want to call it this, but just to be crude about it, the power balance is with the membership, the organization, the purchaser, if we say it. And a lot of the time, agencies might try to jump through hoops to say that they can achieve certain expectations. I know we, as an agency, have probably done this in the past. We try not to do this, and we try to manage expectations as well as possible, whereby we talk about, 3 constraints and how they work and how you can fix not all 3. It's impossible to fix them all. So I think expectation setting is a really big thing in the whole structure, because expectation setting comes from a lot of things. So what you're trying to achieve against the budget that you have. And sometimes an organization might not have the biggest budget in the world, but have requirements, in inverted commas, that want to achieve the most that you can possibly achieve. So it's about managing those expectations from get-go to delivery and through delivery.
Sure, I get what you're talking about in terms of the agency engagement, but we're moving slightly outside of the scope of this discussion, and I think we've got scheduled a separate conversation to talk about the agency engagement models. To give you an example of what I mean by, say, negative scenarios that we've come across, and touching on your point about independence. So you mentioned that it's important to be independent from the agency so that you don't need to run to the agency every time you need to do something. Well, I would argue it's also important to be independent, that if you do need that development resource, you don't have to go back to the same agency. So one of the examples that I'm aware of, where we come across very often, and one of my pet hates, bespoke CMS solutions or agency-owned CMS solutions that have been designed perfectly for your particular vertical, and therefore we're going to convince you that's the best one because it's been built specifically for memberships or whatever vertical you're working in. So these are that's an example of what I would say a nightmare scenario for an agency, where they end up effectively, for the lack of a better term, being held hostage by the agency, because if they're not happy with the agency, or they're not happy with the agency's delivery times, they need to go and completely migrate to a different platform, because that's their own proprietary software that nobody else knows how to work with, nobody else can work with, and more often than not, in fact, in every case, the technology is always falling behind in terms of the capabilities and where the industry is going. So is there any other examples similar to that one that you would see as common bad practices between agencies and membership organizations when it comes to CMS technology?
Yes, I would say going straight to an agency with a preferred technology and not being open at all to even considering other technologies, based on the agency's understanding of the organisation, unless they've gone through a very thorough sort of selection process with another agency prior to engaging with the agency that's going to build it. I would say that's a key thing to look into.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, hence why you should not let this technology drive the project.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other than that, I would say understand what resources it's going to take to actually get full use of the technology that you're going to choose in the end. Because often we'll see membership organisations go from let's say a small WordPress or Umbraco site to a Kentico or Sitecore with all the bells and whistles, but realistically they don't adapt their internal resources, the people, the training, the skills that they've got to get the most out of it. And in the end, you end up with just using 10% of a CMS, which you're paying a large chunk of money for. So, and you end up, just being generally disgruntled about that.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that disgruntled point, probably identifying the ongoing costs of a CMS and the upgrades, etc., that it might have, because dependent on the organization and the CMS that they choose, there's going to be ongoing upgrade, maintenance, hosting, support, whatever those costs are. And sometimes they're very much under anticipated by organizations. So I know Rob just mentioned WordPress, and I don't really know many organizations that are using WordPress. But for example, when you upgrade, there's not just that CMS you have to upgrade. So if let's not just use WordPress, but if a CMS uses add-ons, will they need to be upgraded? How regularly will they need to be upgraded? Will they need to be replaced in the future? There's a lot of anticipation or lack of anticipation of those ongoing costs. And when it comes round to that cost, again, agencies, organizations get a little bit disgruntled around, oh, 1 minute, we weren't expecting this. So that's sort of...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, I just want to try and take stock of what our objective, what value we want to try and give to our listeners in this particular conversation. And I also don't want the listeners to walk away just focusing on all the risks and negative aspects of undertaking the CMS selection process. So I'm aware that we've kind of quite spontaneously talked about a lot of problems and concerns, and we've gone sporadically towards different problems that would happen at different stages of a selection process. So if we were to turn this into a positive conversation, and we can say that in the vast majority of cases, as long as the right step is followed, the project will be successful. The organization will select the right technology, because this technology is almost, it's like a foundation for the entire digital strategy thereafter. So it's a very important choice. But as long as this a few simple and sensible steps are taken and things are done in the right sequence, then organizations will set themselves up for success. And there is, in most cases, a happy ending as long as these steps are followed.
So guys, just to bring it in and sort of like conclude our conversation, I'd say there's a few things that we should give as tips maybe to the viewers in terms of what they should look for in their CMS selection process. So to summarize, basically analyze their topology, both internal in terms of resources and their technology stacks that they use, identify their budgets, look at their business objectives over the next 3 to 5 years, as well as the potential CMS vendors' growth plan and roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years, and ensure that the agency that they choose, who are going to help them with their selection process, are well aware of their requirements and are, I would say, agnostic in terms of what propositions they might come forward with in terms of CMSs. And these general bits, along with everything else we've talked about and the pitfalls we've talked about, should help an organization really have the correct platform and foundation to pick the suitable CMS. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to throw in that I might have missed.
I think the only bit is, when you mention the budgets, I think understand all the constraints. There could be other constraints, such as a key time frame by which a project needs to be completed or something along those lines. So these all need to be taken into account at that stage.
Brilliant. So I think to summarize, if you guys found this content useful, then give us a like, share, subscribe, even donate if you want. We've got nowhere to donate, but do it. Yeah, let us know. And if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, also let us know.